Welcome to Forward Fest. We are so glad you are here engaging with some of the bold ideas and forward thinking that make Princeton the special place that it is. We are so glad you are here. My name is Liu Chen, with some of the bold ideas for Trend Arts and Princeton, Director of the Trend Youth Orchestra. We want to hear from you throughout a year of forward thinking. Welcome to Forward Fest. We are so glad you are here, engaging with some of the bold ideas and forward thinking that make Princeton the special place that it is. We want to hear from you throughout a year of forward thinking, and particularly during Forward Fest. Be sure to tag any of your forward thinking posts on social media with #PrincetonForward. That includes any questions or comments you want to share with the Princetonians who will be part of our broadcast today. It is my pleasure to introduce you to the moderator of our Thinking Forward Arts and Humanities session, Rachael, Princeton class of 2002. A man of letters on both sides of the publishing world, Rachael is an executive editor at Harper One, a division of HarperCollins, and also the author of the novels Blue Boy and No One Can Pronounce My Name. A lover of not only words, but song and the arts in general, he will, no doubt, have a fascinating discussion with four of Princeton's forward thinkers today. All yours, Rachael.
Thank you so much, Lou. Welcome everybody to Princeton's Forward Fest in the session, Thinking Forward Arts and Humanities. I'm delighted to be with you for what I'm sure will be a riveting discussion on the urgent need for arts and humanities in today's world. I'm pleased to be joined today by four of Princeton's forward thinkers in this area. With us today are Rachael DeLue, who's the Christopher Binyon Sarofim 86 Professor in American Art, Professor of Art and Archaeology and American Studies, and Chair of the Department of Art and Archaeology. As well as Beatriz Colomina, the Howard Crosby Butler Professor of the History of Architecture and co-director of the Program in Media and Modernity. As well as Elizabeth Hellmuth Margulis, Professor of Music, and Autumn Womack, Assistant Professor of African American Studies and English, and the Charles G. Osgood University Preceptor. We'll start by welcoming Rachael DeLue to the discussion.
Hi there, it's nice to be here.
Welcome, it's so great to see you and so great to meet you in this wonderful forum. I think, this has been such an uncertain time for so many of us, and I'm so glad to have a substantive discussion about the arts and about the humanistic studies, because I think personally for me, it's been such a comfort to turn to art, to think about art, and to think about what solace it can provide to us. And so from an art historian's perspective in your case, of course, you could talk about the place of art in general to help us, orient ourselves in time and in place and in community with others. But as an expert in American art in particular, in your opinion, what does art tell us about, in terms of how you help your students use art in an interdisciplinary way to understand evolving ideas of America, what it means to be American, what we look at as the American landscape right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad. I'll just echo you by saying that I'm delighted that we can have this substantial discussion as well, because I really do think the arts and humanities are essential. They have something to do with every aspect of our world, and the more I can have a platform to say that, the happier I am. So the humanities in general, the humanities involve the study of human culture, and another way of putting that is to say, we humanists study how people have created their world, but also how the world creates people. And in that process of creating and being created by, images have been involved, works of art, but also a whole host of other kinds of images, everything from scientific illustrations to television shows, political commercials, and these days images that circulate on social media. And one of the things that I try to help my students understand is just how essential picturing, visual expression has been to how people decide what the world is, what it should mean, and who belongs in what way to that world. So just as texts and the kinds of historical records, everything from the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution and the Gettysburg Address shape the world and shape the people in it, images do as well. And that's one of the things I try to help my students understand, in particular with regard to the American context in which images have played a role from the very outset. We start in my courses in the 17th century. That always surprises my students. They didn't realize that we have to go that far back in time, but we do. And so that's what I try to help my students understand. And I try to help them be smarter than the images that inundate them every second of their lives as well.
Yes, we're such a visual culture right now, and increasingly so. I can absolutely see why that's the case. In the middle of the pandemic and online teaching, obviously that has intersected with the Black Lives Matter protests that have been going on throughout the year, and in the midst of the election cycle as well. So there was such a confluence of factors that was having an impact on people's visual culture. And I think that you actually took a look at your survey course, at the American Art Survey course that you were putting together, or that you had put together, and thought you basically needed to start over from scratch, that you had to recontextualize things within what's going on now. Could you speak a little bit about how you thought about that and how you implemented that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So when it was announced that we were going to teach online this fall semester, the semester that's just wrapping up, I was left without a course because I planned to be excavating the Princeton battlefield with my colleague Nathan Arrington, and that the pandemic wasn't having that. So I needed to invent a course from scratch. And I thought, well, what do I want to teach? But I also thought, what do my students need? What do they need right now? And what is it incumbent upon me to help them understand? And so what I decided to do is teach a course about the now by creating what might be called a kind of by chronology. So the course tracked the present day, and in particular the presidential election, alongside a study of America's history and the role of images within that history. But we started with Black Lives Matter and we ended with Black Lives Matter. And race, racism, the reassertion of white supremacy, and anti-racist protest framed the entirety of the course, because one of the things that the humanistic studies do is we try to figure out where we are, where we're going. And the only way to do that is to figure out and understand where we've been. So I wanted to frame a conversation about the now with a dive back in time into the past. So students have a sense that the past isn't irrelevant to the now, that there are real material connections. And one of the things that I did differently is make literal those connections by talking about Black Lives Matter protest signs in the same breath that I talked about ethnographic images of indigenous cultures created in the 17th century on the part of European explorers, just to make clear that what we're seeing now has roots in a time centuries ago. I also decided to completely expand the purview of the course because I am an art historian, right? And so my job is to talk about the history of art. But I also wanted the students to be almost equal collaborators with me. And that meant that I had to talk about their image world, which isn't my image world necessarily. And it's probably good that their image world isn't my image world. I mean, but I decided, okay, well, we'll talk about art, but we'll also talk about television, and we'll talk about film, and we'll talk about memes, and we'll talk about social media and Instagram. And TikTok. I mean, my kids have never thought I was as cool as I was until this semester because mom was watching TikTok.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, so I kind of had to reinvent what I thought my wheelhouse is in order to, to bring the conversation to them and help have it on their terms. And the last thing I'll say is I introduced, a lot of times historians and humanists ask our students to analyze things that other people make. But I decided that my students' assignments would be rather than necessarily only analytical, they'd be generative. So I had them write scripts, I had them create monuments, I had them rewrite scenes from film so that in the process of inventing, they could analyze material from the past and the present, but also participate in a literal way in the production of images in the now. And I think that was really vital for them in understanding the stakes of image making.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you that question, which was if you could name a couple of particular images that are part of the course that you were teaching, and then conversely, were there particular images that students brought to you that really, as you were saying, opened your worldview or your visual world over the course of the past several weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I had them think about quite a lot over the course of several weeks was the history of Confederate monuments. And this is something that is absolutely topical, but it's also a matter that not a whole lot of people know the detailed history about. And so I asked them to think about, I presented them with the material, I asked them to think about monuments, and then I presented them and we talked about a whole series of what we called new monuments, right. Rewritings, re-envisionings of what an American monument might be. We did this with American icons and American anthems as well. One of the assignments was to pick the anthem of the 21st century, and the selections were amazing. Everything from heavy metal to to Megan Thee Stallion, which was perfectly fine with me. So I asked them to look at this body of work, and then I said, okay, well, what would you make if you were to design a monument for Princeton's campus? What would it look like? What kinds of languages would it employ? And they came up with amazing things. Some of them created abstract monuments, some of them created figurative monuments, and they all learned in the process how difficult it is to figure out what a thing that's supposed to be about all of America it has to look like. And one of them actually introduced a monument that was absence. It was nothing. It was just an empty pedestal. Oh, and wow. I thought that was brilliant, because my students said, I can't, there's no way. There are no words to encompass everything that one ought to say in a monument.
Wow, that's really incredible to hear. I think that, again, that what a breadth of things that you're learning. Yes, taking that all into account. You're right, it is so overwhelming that this kind of blank space might very well encompass how overwhelming things really might be. And it's, as you're noting, which I think is such an asset to the course, is that it's a work in progress, that there's a progression that's happening visually for everybody. I'm sorry to say that we're out of time for this segment, but I know you'll be back for our panel discussion. So thank you so much, Professor LaRue. And next, I would love to welcome Beatriz Colomina, Professor of Architecture, Co-Director of Program in Media and Modernity. So Professor LaRue talked about finding, who we are as Americans through art, through visual culture, through just kind of thinking about what we see. And you bring a kind of host of different perspectives to our conversation. First, you look through the lens of architecture and think about how we can use our relationship with space to tell us more about our shared humanity. But your new project in particular explores how architecture is always concerned about sickness and health. Ideas that at the moment, especially in the middle of the pandemic, are front and center for so many of us. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about your hauntingly beautiful collaboration, Sick Architecture, which speaks to that very issue.
Well, thank you, Rachael. I'm really happy to talk with you about this and about whatever. This project of Sick Architecture started way before the pandemic. It started in the fall of 2019 when I was teaching a class on pandemics and architecture. Because this is the point, that architecture and illness has always been totally interrelated. So the history of the cities, in many ways, is the history of the seas. But, you know, and you can even say that the beginning of architecture is the beginning of the seas, right? So in creating an enclosure from ourselves, in protecting ourselves from the elements, we created the conditions for the seas. And this is not me saying this, it's already in 1880, during the big health exhibition in London, a doctor declared this. But more recent studies have demonstrated that this is the case even if you go back to the Neolithic, right? So the first constructions and the first really enclosures produce fatal diseases. So there is this really close relationship between illnesses and disease, illnesses and architecture and the city. So the city, for example, is shaped by disease. So there are layers and layers of that are produced by pandemics, but as soon as the pandemic passes, we forget entirely about it, right? We develop amnesia, completely collective amnesia. We act as if pandemic is the very first one. Now we are totally surprised now, but what is happening? But this is nothing compared to other pandemics in history and the effects they have had on cities, right? For example, all the infrastructure of the 19th century, the clean water, the sewage, the urban parks was in response to the pandemics of cholera, typhoid fever, etc. And even modern architecture was in many ways in response to tuberculosis, which was killing millions of people every year all over the world. And it presented itself like this kind of prophylactic that will protect you from this deadly disease, but we tend to forget about it. So I was teaching this class in which start with my own research on tuberculosis and modern architecture, but expanded into so many amazing topics that I didn't think about. You know, I don't know what to say. For example, population control. In India during the 70s and the role that architecture played, so the apartment, the kind of housing as a kind of birth control, or Ellis Island and the way in which the border in the United States was medicalized, and the gold fever and how the hospitals in San Francisco were built during all these epidemics, and how prejudice, which is also something that always appears in every pandemic. In every pandemic, there is this prejudice, the ugliest part of who we are emerges, right? And this is, and so many others. Arizona, which was kind of the marketed in the United States as the place to go for the cure of tuberculosis, or Hamburg. So many different cases. Well, then the pandemic struck, and the students were depressed. Why? Because all of a sudden they were planning to go to India or to Sao Paulo or to Europe with the funding that the university every year provides so generously for their research, etc. But there are also personal things. My boyfriend is in Buenos Aires, and I thought that now when I finish, you know, so they were depressed. And I thought to myself, what could I do? And then it occurred to me that we could take the papers that they have beautifully written in the fall and edited them, and I made an agreement with Eflux Architecture, which is an online architectural magazine, and we spent the summer editing the papers among ourselves, and then in collaboration with Eflux Architecture, they were published this fall in a series of articles that appear like 2 or 3 per week, and now we have even been asked to organize an exhibition in a museum of architecture in Brussels. So the whole thing keeps getting bigger.
I can imagine. So, I mean, that's taken so many lives of its own. Yeah.
Yes, and it's very exciting because for the students, they were very excited because then now they have a work that is published, but also they went through the whole process of how do you turn an academic paper into a published paper, how do you deal with a copy editor, all these dramas, look at what he cut from my paper, and me, which I also take it seriously when people cut things that I think are important. No, this is what always happens, but you can answer back, you can push back, but you can also take the occasion to think about why are they raising questions about this war, about this sentence, and so on. So it was a learning experience for all of us. So,
well, I think that's probably their amnesia plays a part too, because they don't know these things that we've forgotten. But I was going to ask you, one thing that struck me when you were just speaking is that because I think as a country we've dealt with this all year, which is, it seems very class related, what you're talking about, the idea that people get compartmentalized quite literally within the architecture in their cities. And because there's been such a racial divide and a class divide in this country, I was wondering if you could speak a bit about, how you situate. We only have a couple of minutes, but I thought maybe you could say a little bit about how you see it in that context.
Yes, it's very, very important because in this pandemic, we all have become experts in architecture. All of a sudden, everybody knows what 6 feet is. The university has become experts in architecture. Restaurant has become experts in architecture. All these plexiglass, all these people thinking about different ways in which we can protect each other. But the interesting thing, I think, what this pandemic has revealed is also the invisible city. The invisible city of all the inequalities, the unequal access to housing, to care, all these hidden workers, etc. So I think this is very, very important that as architects, we concentrate too much on the visible, right? On what can we do? Because that's our profession, right? Let's make spaces that are safer and all of this. But I think the important question is to focus also in a more social city. So this is also, I'm an optimist always. My hope for the future.
That's
so
wonderful.
Not a city that will be more equitable. Yeah,
that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Again, we'll speak with you a bit during the panel, so thank you. Before we speak with our next forward thinker, we wanted to share a little of Princeton's architecture, Firestone Library, beloved Firestone Library, where I did so many hours of work in the physical hub of the humanities and so much more. It's recently seen a 10-year renovation project completed. This short video that we're going to show you, filmed prior to this past semester, when few were able to physically enjoy the new spaces, will give you a taste of the updates that our 21st century learners will be taking advantage of for years to come. So here's Firestone. Back now with Professor Margulis, Professor of Music. It's so wonderful to speak with you. I'm a huge music enthusiast myself. I don't know what I would have done during these several months without all of the music I've been listening to, both working and just relaxing. So thank you for all the work that you do. We've talked a lot already about how one field finds many references in others. And while you certainly look to the humanities disciplines for some of your work, most of what you do bridges the humanities and the sciences. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about how you combine musicology and cognitive science in your work.
Sure. So one of the really, I think, fascinating things about music is that it has now a long tradition of both scientific and humanistic inquiry. So it provides a really interesting opportunity to explore what can happen when these two worlds really partner. And I think one of the kind of key aspects that comes to the fore when you start trying to do work like this, is the possible tension between science's commitment to try to uncover principles that explain lots of different things, right? Versus humanistic commitment to the unique and particular and individual and varied. So a lot of the work that I've been involved with tries to really identify ways to understand this kind of nuance and variety using tools that sometimes didn't think they were suited to those kinds of questions to begin with.
That's great. I mean, you arrived at Princeton, I think just over a year ago now, and established the Music Cognition Lab. And that includes a lot of computation and neuroimaging software, and to investigate the kind of moment that we're in right now and the current experience of listeners everywhere. And this doesn't seem to be the typical kind of start for like a startup package for a professor at Princeton. And so taking this interdisciplinary approach and being able to start something like that, I was just wondering, what at Princeton in particular made that possible, and how's that experience been among your colleagues in terms of starting something as ambitious as that?
Yeah, I love that question because that's been the most striking thing to me in my short time here on campus is the level of openness and flexible thinking where people, as soon as I started my first grad class, people wandered in from departments across campus, and there'd be the break in the middle of the seminar, and the musicologists and the neuroscientists would be going out for coffee and coming back with 16 ideas for a really cool project. And in fact, since arriving, I've been really trying to figure out what the alchemy is. So how this place really fosters that spirit of interdisciplinary inquiry so successfully. And I can't say that I've really got the answer, but I'm really enjoying being the beneficiary of that environment.
I was going to ask you, I don't want to put you on the spot, but have you heard of specific music that's been comforting people during this very discomforting time? I'm curious to know if there are specific examples that you've found or that other people have told you that have kind of bridged these two worlds and helped them during this period of turmoil.
Yeah, this fall, I co-taught with a composer in our department, the junior seminar, which is a course for all the majors who are in their third year here. And it was one of the most fun classes I've ever taught, because here were students who've spent several years together on campus, really important in each other's lives. And here they were on Wednesday afternoons appearing on each other's screens. And frequently they would have done things like they wrote songs for each other. They'd show up in class and play these things that they'd written for their friends who, watching that was extremely moving and inspiring.
That's so, I'm getting teary just hearing about that.
So I will say that we did as well, so I'm not alone.
In this moment, again, music is providing comfort to people, and I think it's really a form of self-care. I think that's really how people go about listening to it. And this is a very broad question, but in what you've seen during this period of time, not only just in your work, but in the world at large, are there any big lessons you've learned that you didn't know before about what role music plays in our lives? Like what the real kind of almost psychosomatic comfort it provides to us really is?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're really seeing is the way that people can have these really powerful, positive, bonding kinds of experiences with music, right? But it's not some kind of easy explanation or formula where you can, people, I'll sometimes get these emails where people want to partner to create the magic song that, everybody will love and will create world peace. I don't know. And it's just the wrong way of thinking about it, right? Because the same music that might provide solace to one person might be quite alienating and, provide grating or provide the opposite to somebody else. So it's a really complex intersection between what's happening in a piece of music and what's happening in the contextual circumstances around it that really allow for these deep experiences.
Yeah, I think culturally we have this bias in which we think that people who primarily focus on the humanities have this deeper, I don't know, emotional connection with music, whereas people who are the more scientific end have, I don't know, a more methodical approach. But I'm sure you've seen those lines blur so thoroughly in doing this work. And so you mentioned earlier how there were neuroscientists who were coming to speak with you. So I guess you've seen that, right, over the period of study, that these things are so much more entwined than we think of them culturally.
Absolutely. And to me, the art is really in figuring out how you take big concepts that are critical to musical experience, things like memory or enjoyment, and really operationalize them in a way that is sufficiently sensitive to what these experiences really entail. And that's where getting people in the room who have really different perspectives in multiple ways, including disciplinary backgrounds, can produce research that is much more scientifically sound as well as humanistically insightful.
Yeah, I can imagine that, I think about this a lot because people who are musicians who enjoy playing music together, a lot of them can't be physically together right now. So that's a huge challenge because obviously there's something about being together, and especially if you're in a classical ensemble, or as somebody who was in an a cappella group at Princeton, I've been bereft to have gone through this experience. But I mean, are you seeing people form a different sense of community in this remote learning situation in which they're finding new ways to create community around this idea?
Yeah, I'm also seeing almost, it feels like the return to the mixtape, right? People really curating and sharing and distributing playlists in ways that are feeling really meaningful to them. We saw a bit of that in the junior seminar as well.
Yeah, I think I think about that a lot too, that when I was on campus now, almost 20 years ago, that was the time of, Winamp players and Napster and all those things. And it was all about sharing, what we were listening to at that time. So I guess you're right. We're reverting almost to a time where people had that experience, and that was how they lived, their musical lives. So, but yeah, I thank you for all the work that you're doing, because I think we're going to need this, regardless of when this pandemic actually ends, so to speak. I think we're going to need that sense of community that music provides. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
And I believe right now we will go to speak with, is it Professor Womack next? I want to make sure I'm getting that right.
Come on.
Hello. So great to speak with you. This is Professor Autumn Womack. She's the Assistant Professor of English and African American Studies. And we're going to talk a bit about the kind of power of narrative, how words and visualized narratives give context to our own stories. So, our other forward thinkers here have talked a lot about piecing together different elements of a work or practice to create and uncover the hidden meaning in things. And one of the things that I think your work explores is how the intersection of literature, history, visual media, including, that's photography, film, video, TV, reveals how we quite literally see the world, and that has a profound impact on our understanding of culture. So I was wondering if, in a sense, especially even hearing what Professor LaRue was saying, if you could speak a little bit about how you've seen those things play out, especially in the past, several months.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that question. My dog may start barking like a crazy person in a few seconds, so excuse me if that happens. Yeah, the past, I guess it's almost 6 or 7 months now, have really, I think, provided both a challenge and an opportunity in so many different ways for all of us, and especially our students, to really begin to think complexly about the ways that the narrative and the visual and the historical all work together. One of the things that's been really interesting for me is to see how people are actively returning to the past and really interrogating history and how we come to understand history and the archives that we summon to think through our present moment in really interesting and complex ways. So I've really been in awe of the way that both on kind of minor media, like something like Instagram, but then really public platforms like the New York Times or like big visual magazines like The Atlantic are actually all doing this work of trying to piece together a different historical narrative in order to rehistoricize our present. And they're doing this primarily through a really visual medium. So that's one of the things that I think I've noticed in the past couple of months. That's really been quite an exciting
Yeah, I think Instagram in particular, you're right. People are, it's almost like they're living their the lives they can't share via that medium.
Yeah.
But you know, you're you know, who is asking the questions and documenting answers does a lot to shape our cultural narratives, and who really gets to tell these narratives. And I think you've talked a lot about this, and as did another, you know, glorious Princetonian, Toni Morrison, who's been such an inspiration to so many of us. So, you know, I'm sure, again, especially this year, you've thought a lot about, you know, how voice plays a role in understanding who we are, both as individuals and then as a collective. So I was wondering if you could speak just a bit about that, like in terms of who's allowed to tell which narratives and why.
Yeah, I mean, it's who's allowed to tell which narratives and which narratives we're given access to. I think those two things are really important because they're so interrelated, and part of who we give authority to speak is who we acknowledge as having that authority. And that also has everything to do with kind of a long archival institutional history that gives power to certain kinds of voices. So I think that, you know, one of the things that I like to think through in all of my work, and especially in my teaching this year, I've really tried to foreground this, is highlighting these different actors and different voices that are normally just overlooked or quieted or really remain opaque. Yeah, so I think that that's thinking collectively and thinking together about both the voices that get quiet and then the archives that are not, or the archival sources that are also not summoned to do that kind of work.
Yeah, I can speak as somebody who works in book publishing. This has been an ongoing discussion for many years, obviously, in terms of literally who's writing books and who gets to publish them and who gets to, you know, really tell their stories. So one of your current projects is a collaboration with Monica Huerta, the assistant professor of English and American Studies. And I want to quote this. It's about the long histories of anti-racist activism, racial justice organizing, and coalition building as they relate to questions of narrative, storytelling, and humanistic study more broadly, which I think all of us can say that is exactly the probably combination of ideas and feelings that we've been thinking about this year. So I was just wondering if you could tell us more about that project.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. We love this project. So over the summer, and really in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and all of the global anti-racist activism that was being exercised in that moment, Professor Huerta and I were really trying to think creatively and collaboratively about how we might rethink the relationship between the academy and activist work and activism. And often, I mean, we're always working together, but it's often not organic. And there's a way that we think about the university as being so siloed from kind of grassroots on the ground organizing. So we were trying to think of a framework to make sense of the overlaps. And so storytelling and narrative became a really generative way for us to think about the world of activism and the scholarly world as doing similar work. So one of the things that we are really invested in is providing a platform and a structure where we can think about the work that activists do as scholarly work, and we can think about the work that we as scholars do as activism, which often feels counterintuitive to folks. So it's been great. We've had workshops, we've got more planned in the spring, and the idea is also to give students, right, really a way to think about activism in a much more tangible, on the ground, less abstract way, because so many of them are really doing incredible forms of activism in ways that they're not even really aware of.
That's great. I mean, are there particular kind of images or cultural moments that you've seen during this period of time that you would cite as things that have been inspirations for that type of work?
Yeah, we had a meeting yesterday where we were talking about this. So we've been really inspired by, well, two things are actually interesting. First, we were thinking about the way that it was difficult actually to think of an iconic image to represent all of the work and the labor and the activism that was happening this summer. And so there were a few images that were circulating, but it was less about a single image and more about the narrative of the moment and a series of images. So that was interesting. We've thought a lot about video work and the videos that have come out that organizations like Black Lives Matter and Mihente have put out, and the way that they are summoning different kinds of technological and technical innovation to tell the story of really endurance and Black living in a way that's really crucial.
Yeah, I think we were talking about that earlier, the idea that people have a tendency not to, they don't necessarily narrativize over a long period of time. They maybe narrativize within their own, lifetimes, but not necessarily looking to the past and sort of weaving this narrative together, which I think is really, really crucial. And I think, are there parallels between the kind of 60s civil rights movement and now that have been particularly have made a particular impact on the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, so I think about this a lot. And I think that there are so many overlaps between the late 60s, particularly the late 60s. Like I think about the 1968 moment as being really resonant with our moment. On the one hand, in terms of kind of the visual imagery that's being circulated about people marching in the streets, right? Kind of demands that are being made on institutions and legal infrastructure. But there's also a way, and this I think is the most interesting overlap, the way that Black literary texts were being called upon in the late 1960s moment to kind of do a certain kind of political work, and the way that I think this relates to your question you were asking earlier, the way that Black writers and writers of color are also being summoned now to do some kind of like political reparative work that is really, really strikingly similar to the 1960s moment, where we had really a demand for Black writers to put out books and to reissue and republish out of print books about the Black past. So I think that that's also an interesting way to think about it. The work that we ask Black literary texts and writers of color to do at key historical moments, that's another way to track the overlaps and resonances that we keep seeing.
Are there kind of, again, visual touch points or examples that your students in particular that you've seen coalesce around things where maybe there's a recurring image or recurring experience that they've been invoking in class?
Yeah, so I teach a class on 19th century African American literature, and it's always a class that also asks us to call or asks the students to think about a number of different kinds of materials and text and media. So they were really, they kept returning to images and the photographs and the videos that circulated of anti-Black violence, and that kept being the touchstone that they would return to when we were reading something like Frederick Douglass's 1845 autobiography, right? Or when we were thinking through even, photographic portraits from the 1890s, or lynching statistics that Ida B. Wells would put out. They kept returning to the viral circulation of these images, and they weren't so much thinking about, they were thinking about the kind of the failure of historical progress in that moment, right? Like how is this repetition? How is this image still repeating itself? Why are we still calling upon these images to do a certain kind of political work and they're still failing? So it was both like a desire to understand the failure of progress, but also really seeing in sharp and incisive ways this historic recurrence.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being with us and for speaking with us. And again, we'll be on the panel discussion. So please stay where you are, because we want to bring you back with all of today's guests to be in conversation together in a bit. But first, to bring some of your thoughts about voice to life, we want to share a video about artist Mario Moore, who is a 2018-2019 Hodder Fellow in Princeton's Lewis Center for the Arts. The work of several lifetimes was an exhibition of new work created by Moore, depicting Black men and women who work at or around Princeton's campus. The university, as part of its ongoing history and sense of place work to expand the narrative of Princeton's history and foster an inclusive sense of place on campus, has worked with the Princeton University Art Museum and purchased 5 pieces of Moore's work. 3 of the portraits will be installed and displayed in various high traffic and public locations on campus this December.
So my name is Mario Moore, and I'm a 2018-2019 Princeton Hodder Fellow. The Hodder Fellowship gave me an opportunity to pretty much have a studio space of my own, somewhere to create, to really focus on an idea. It also gave me the funds and resources I need to make, this idea come to reality. In particular, I was interested in the Hodder Fellowship for Princeton University because I was interested in painting Black men that work in and around the campus. Often I think about blue-collar jobs as being a ground base for African Americans during the Great Migration to be able to buy houses, pay for their children's education. So I started to think about those jobs and think about when I was a student, even in undergrad, and the people that I talked to the most were like, dining and security and custodians. They really become a type of family because for the most part, those are the people that you see in those positions that are African American. I feel like it's time that we recognize them. We see them for more than just their work because they're more valuable than that. So it became a thing of how do I shine a light on them in a positive light and show them in a way that they haven't been seen. At the same time, the plan and project kind of expanded because it includes Black women as well. It's been a collaborative effort. It was me meeting with them, doing sketches from life, and then us coming up together with an idea of how they want to be painted. I wanted the painting to be about their workplace and kind of put them in the position of power and some type of attempt of royalty or appreciation. Michael, who's in this painting, I met him basically walking into the museum and talked to him and asked him, where can I get my hair cut? And then I started telling him about my project. And it's funny because he introduces me to another artist, but I'm like, no, but I want to paint you in this project. And then he starts to understand. And he's like, yeah, I would love to be a part of that. This piece was more of an invitation into a space that actually exists as part of the museum. The paintings on the walls are not in the museum, but they're actual artwork. So these are artists that I really admire, like Henry Ossawa Tanner. That's a painting of his father, who was a pastor. The piece by Charles White of Frederick Douglass. The painting to the left is by Barclay Hendricks, really well known for figurative paintings. And the sculpture is an Ife Nigerian sculpture. And then I had to throw myself in the mix with the champions. So that's a painting that I did in 2011, but Princeton doesn't have these paintings in their collection. So it's like an invitation into something that a show that I would like to see or pieces that I would like to be highlighted. The culmination of my work as a Hodder Fellow has created this exhibition titled The Work of Several Lifetimes. Basically what I wanted to do was create a holistic approach of how I produce the paintings about Black blue-collar workers. Create a space where they feel included and show that in a space where it all feels connected. My favorite part of the show was definitely seeing the families and seeing the people seeing their paintings for the first time. All their families were essentially celebrating, giving hugs, taking pictures. It was really, really about the people. It was a celebration about them, the work that they do, their lives, beyond their job titles, beyond what they do here. So that felt really special. This is war. You're gonna feel this pain. This is war.
Next, we will reflect on Professor Margulis' straddling music and science with a look at a timely collaboration between musicians with the Met Orchestra and a team of researchers working with Howard Stone, the Donald R. Dixon 69 and Elizabeth W. Dixon Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. We will follow that video with a special treat from the Princeton University concerts.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marna Seltzer, Director of Princeton University Concerts, the university's presenting series. Every year, we bring musicians from all over the world to campus and present them in our wonderful concert hall, Richardson Auditorium. When the pandemic first struck last March, we were forced to cancel the bulk of our concert series, and we immediately began asking ourselves, what could we do to stay relevant? How could we continue to deliver our audiences great music and to create a sense of community? One of the ways that we've done this is through virtual watch parties. We've asked musicians from their own homes around the world to join us for a short concert, to tell us about what they've programmed, and then to interact with us in a live Q&A where audiences get a chance to have kind of a virtual backstage experience with the musicians. What you are about to hear is our opening concert from this fall, which features the Takash String Quartet. We thought it was entirely appropriate to open our watch party series with the Takash Quartet because they are an ensemble that has appeared on our series more than almost any other ensemble in our 127-year history. Plus, they were originally scheduled to open our series in person this fall. The Takash Quartet chose to program a piece by a wonderful African-American composer, Samuel Coleridge Taylor. It's a piece that was previously unknown to them and has not been heard often, and it was great to have them include this in their program. You will hear the Coleridge Taylor, and then you'll also hear an excerpt from the live Q&A when one of our faculty members on a limb asked them a question about the challenges of diversifying the Western canon of classical music.
Actually, what makes music so powerful and so amazing is its capacity to include so many voices and so many people and so many hearts and so many minds, and to make that kind of connection across so many continents. And I think for me, some of these questions that you raised, I keep coming back to the same answer, which is trying to reconnect with the parts of music making that are inclusive and the parts of music making that involve sharing and involve growing and learning, not the parts of music making that are so wonderful that we need to just make a special club of it and not include other people in it. Mm-hmm.
Welcome, everybody, to now the wonderful panel discussion that we're going to have. So I thought, first of all, thank you so much to each of you for the amazing discussions that we had and the work that you're doing. I think, in each of our discussions, we were sort of focusing individually on the work that you're doing, the projects that you're working on, the classes you may be teaching. And I was wondering if you could speak about your fields more broadly, like if you're seeing a sea change in the work that you're doing among other colleagues elsewhere, or if there's trends you've noticed that are happening within each of your fields. So I just thought it might be kind of fascinating to hear about that kind of broader perspective. Professor LaRue, would you like to begin?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think along with many other things, the discipline of art history has had to shift gears and transmute because of the immediate conditions, not just of the pandemic, but of the socio-political conditions of 2020. And this is manifested in many different ways. And I think, one of the key ways, and this is related to something that Autumn was saying during your conversation with her, a really hard look, harder than before, at what we're not including or even what we're not seeing in terms of the histories we tell and the stories we relate to our students. So not just people who are left out, but absence as such. What are some of the absences that we're not even aware of yet? That the histories that we need to sort of pull into visibility and legibility, and that's different than just saying, well, we need to wiggle around the canon a little bit. It's just taking a really hard look at exactly what story it is we're telling.
Yeah, Professor Womack, you were talking about that, the idea that there's this, again, we were talking about who gets to tell what story. And I guess that has been a broader discussion. Since I work in media, that is absolutely central to a lot of the work that we've been doing. So is that also the case you're seeing sort of this communal kind of broadening of how people think about which voices are telling which stories?
Yeah, it's interesting because I work both in the fields of African American studies and English. So African American studies, it's interesting because it's like, yes, we've always been doing this work. You guys are catching up to us in a way that's really interesting. And certainly in English, I mean, it's a question about language, right? And the language we deploy to talk about, right, the things that we're talking about, but also, I mean, exactly what Rachael is saying, thinking about not just what's left out, but what has constituted those absences or what has constituted our limited vantage point to begin with, what it might mean to rethink entirely how we imagine texts relating to each other. Like, what does it mean to think about reading a Jane Austen novel alongside something by Frank Webb, who was an early African-American novelist, right? I mean, I think that those are real kind of a practical example, but it's the kind of questions that we're grappling with.
And Professor Colomina, since so much of your work has to do with spatial considerations, the idea of being in public spaces, I mean, I can imagine that now that we're in these quite literal quarantine spaces, that must be something that you discuss with other people that has a relevance to, that's kind of almost like you're going into your work almost backwards now in terms of this revisiting. Has that been something that's come up thematically in those discussions?
Yes, definitely. I mean, of course, quarantine, it comes from the Black Death, from the spaces that were established in places like Venice or Dubrovnik, when boats were asked to wait in the harbor, and quarantine spaces where quarantine comes from 40 days. So this has a long history, but as I was saying before, we tend to forget what produces this situation. But connecting a little bit to what Autumn and Rachael are saying, a huge amount of work is happening right now in architecture, which is very, very exciting, and it has a lot to do with unlearning whiteness, because it's a deep work that needs to be to happen. And in that sense, I think I always learn so much from the students. I mean, I think this thing of teaching, what keeps you at it is actually how much is the other way around too. A couple of hours ago, I was in a review at Harvard, and on Zoom, of course. And a student presented this project in Chicago, in the ITT, the Institute of Technology. And is by Miss van der Rohe, the building. It's written about in every book. I never knew that it was built on top of what was extensive African-American housing. So how come, and the project was about reparations, about doing housing for African-Americans, that will be a form of reparation from this incredible tragedy that was the destruction of all this. No book on architecture. Miss van der Rohe is a major figure. No book on IT&T. I mean, it's even in guidebooks they talk about. It's a major canonic, and we have worked so hard to suppress this history. And you know, it's these kinds of stories that we need to unearth. And as I occurred to me to tell these students too, that reparations also have to do with memory, have to do with writing in the history of architecture, these events that we have worked so hard to erase. Right.
And Professor Margulis, I think too, since you are at the kind of intersection of sort of music and science, I mean, because science almost makes music more accessible to people in a situation like this, has that been a consideration too, that maybe it might be a different form of communication that you have available to you with colleagues elsewhere, but maybe it's a situation that's primed a bit more for a moment like this because there's an ability to share that information, to share that science with people in real time?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm seeing a lot right now in both at the intersection of music and science and in music studies more broadly is a commitment to using actually some of the technological affordances of the current moment to really try to build these big global collaborative networks so that many more voices are involved in kind of formulating the questions that are driving the research and really trying to work out how people can communicate kind of across experiences and setting the agenda for their projects.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because technology has become such a, I don't know, it's almost an equalizing factor for so many of us now. And, you know, I've been thinking, I mean, it's so funny because classmates of mine, when we think about our time at Princeton, so much of it was about the in-person interactions we had, both in terms of the classroom and in terms of just socializing and being on campus. And I think, you know, I mean, Professor DeLue, I think you were speaking directly to this, the idea that technology has had a bearing on how you do your work anyway, because you're looking at visual imagery through time and you're looking at the linking factors there. So I can imagine that your relationship with technology has probably changed. It's difficult in some ways, but for the better probably, right? Because it makes that accessibility a bit more central to the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm so interested in what Elizabeth just said about the affordances of technology, because one of my areas of expertise is the relationship between the history of science and the history of art, and I've written about how sound technology so the introduction of the phonograph changed the way people experience music, and how that changed the way artists experience music and reacted in their artistic production to that. And I'm curious, and Beatriz and Autumn were talking about how their fields have been re-seen texts and spaces, and I'm wondering if there's also a way in which one can describe a rehearing. I mean, is music being heard anew and in a novel way, in the same way that we've been talking about, seeing the objects of inquiry of our field in a new fashion?
Yeah, I love that question, because it just gets at the idea that what we're the sounds aren't fixed, right? There's this ever-changing experience and way of making sense of them, and literally hearing different things in the sounds that I think is really relevant at this moment.
Obviously you focus on music, but Professor Womack, I was going to ask you that too, because in the interdisciplinary nature of your work, I'm sure that music has entered the conversation with a lot of people, because again, it's not only just a class discussion, but it's in a way outside the classroom, but it's us kind of in our own time listening to things that are providing us comfort. And are you seeing any sort of emerging themes in terms of how your students are connecting with that, both within their work or just personally?
That's really interesting, because I taught a class this semester that was on Toni Morrison and the archive. And one of the things that I started doing halfway through the class was asking students to listen to the audiobook, it kind of in rhythm with reading it. And it was so interesting to hear them talk about their listening experience. And so I think one of the things that's opened up is this multimedial way of engaging with even the written text, so that it seemed I'd never had done that assignment before, but having them reflect upon what it meant to hear this text and kind of the rhythm of the syntax and the tonality of the voice, and Morrison is reading most of them, and then being attuned also to the role of music in the novels. And these novels are not just lyrically written, but music is such an important part of the novels. They play a key role, especially in a novel like Jazz, but also her recent novel Home. There's like a key song. So students are really, I think, and they're also spending so much time on screen. We all are. I find myself more prone to listening to books too, but there's something about understanding the way that these texts are designed to be read and heard that I think they're beginning to metabolize, and we all are, I think, in a different way.
And she almost spoke directly to that. That's why she chose to read her audiobooks, because she wanted people to hear it as it was meant to be read. I have to tell you, as a person who works in publishing, the idea that you're buying physical books and audiobooks at the same time makes us very happy. But I actually talking about interpersonal relationships. It actually goes into one of the Facebook comments that we got. One of our viewers wrote. So they wrote, I think that the pandemic has helped people to explore interests online, such as different types of music, literature, etc. This was initially to stave off boredom, but I think it will have lasting effects moving forward. So do you think like curiosity is playing a bigger role in our lives now because we are sort of cut off from things, and that's actually opened us to be more curious about the things around us? Are you seeing that in your classrooms and elsewhere?
I'm seeing it in my classrooms because my students, more so than ever, and I think it's partly because they were in front of their computers for so much time, were finding themselves following trails of crumbs and going down rabbit holes, and then they would come back and share it with me. And every semester students share things with me, but this increased exponentially this semester, and I think. So yes, I think in the larger culture, maybe not so much, but among our students, yes.
Yeah, no, Professor Colomina, I mean, I think, again, this idea that maybe, I don't know, technology is because it makes us connect with one another, but again, because we're isolated from one another, there is this idea of what's out there, what is beyond where I am currently. And that must be a kind of recurring theme that you see too, again, because so much of it is spatial, people are separated. And I assume that that's something that people just want to know more beyond their physical limits, right?
Right. And I think, frankly, that it may even change in our understanding of space. I mean, we have spent so many months in this situation, right? Peeking into the spaces of other people, but in fact separated physically. Like Rachael, I have done a lot of work on the impact of the advent of photography and film on architecture, which was tremendous, right? And right now I'm starting to think, what is the architecture of Zoom? What kind of effects will it have in physical space? It's hard for me to imagine that after this incredible experiment in which we have all been forced to, we would never have agreed to do this, obviously, right? And now we have become so good at it. We can work in bed, we can work at home, and think about all these millions of people all over the world that all of a sudden are working at home, they're working in bed. And I don't think we will return quite to work in the same way that we were doing before. So a lot of things work better, actually. Think about faculty meetings. We never have had so many the graduate school can tell you. One thing is the department meetings, but the graduate school, it's hard to have all these people. Now you go to the meetings on Zoom, there are so many people, all the departmental representatives, all the graduate, the DGSs are there. I mean, never been so many people. So in some ways, it's positive.
Well, to your earlier
But it will
point,
change.
actually, you could argue that, to your earlier point about amnesia, perhaps this almost precludes the amnesia that would happen, that the fact that people have these literal documents of their collaboration during this period of time that hopefully won't be forgotten because there was this global, kind of bearing witness to what was actually happening around us. And I think, with the ability to connect it through technology, we've been talking about collaborations that are making it easier. We got an email at forwardfest.princeton.edu that asks, particularly Professor Womack, if Princeton has had an opportunity to collaborate with curators of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC, specifically with regard to rehistoricizing the narrative. But have you had a chance to do that? And if not, is that something that, that's the way you're thinking about how we might connect different institutions and different areas of study?
I feel like Rachael might have a better answer to that than I do. I mean, I think it's a great idea. I think I love the idea of having major kind of national museums and institutions and scholarly institutions and activist spaces in collaboration and in conversation. I mean, I think they always have to be, and I think it works really well when they are, and we can tell when there has been a collaboration with curation and design. Like you just know that this has a really careful, nuanced, well thought narrativization of artistic moment or historical moment or a genre. But I don't know actually if that has happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that curious note, we're actually out of time, unfortunately, but I want to thank all of you so much for participating. It's been a delight to speak with you. So again, thank you, Professor Margulis, Professor DeLue, Professor Colomina, Professor Womack. I hope you keep safe and healthy. I hope all of you at home and elsewhere keep safe and healthy and keep forward thinking, keep studying. Happy holidays, Happy New Year. We will get through this. And thanks again. It's been a delight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for this first part of December's two-part Forward Fest. Visit forwardthinking.princeton.edu for access to a downloadable resource guide that will help you dive deeper into the interdisciplinary world of arts and humanities, as well as more details on the second part of our December Fest, the accompanying Arts Showcase, which can also be accessed on the Princeton University YouTube channel. Be sure to keep the conversation going on social media with #PrincetonForward. And until next time, keep up the forward thinking.